Hello, Stormie, and hello, everyone, and thank you for watching. And huge thanks to Stormie for inviting me to share with you all as part of her amazing YouTube Astrology Academy. I'm calling this section Astrology, Signs, Planets, and Archetypes. The key word here is archetypes, as we're going to explore a number of archetypal patterns and images of the astrological signs and planets. I'd like to start with a quote from psychologist Carl Jung, who wrote extensively about archetypes in his Archetypes and the Collective Unconscious. Jung said, "Stick with the image," which is my favorite Jung quote. There's just so much to it. We can say, stick with the imagination, the imagination. He also said, image is psyche. So we see when we're imagining, we're active in psyche's world. And with psyche as the Greek word for soul, we can understand when we're imagining we're ensouled. And this is so very important, especially with archetypes. And this is what ancient peoples did. They looked to the night sky and imagined, and they stuck with the images. At first, they saw patterns, which they then noticed moved in groups, constellations. They tracked these movements, and in time, these constellations became images. A ram, a lion, a crab. The ancient night sky was animated, as was the ancient psyche. We've stuck with these ancient images for thousands of years. Or perhaps it's the images that have stuck with us. Either way, they inspire the imagination, and we see the constellations have become the images and symbols of astrology. And within astrology, we have plenty of space to imagine how we view different dynamics, including the signs, the planets, and the houses. What we'll be doing in this presentation will will perceive the astrological signs and the planets from an archetypal perspective, their patterns and images. As Calvin says, if people sat outside and looked at the stars each night, I'll bet they'd live a lot differently. We can also live a lot differently when we look at life through an archetypal lens. So what does that mean, archetype or archetypal? Archetypes are found in what Jung called the collective unconscious. They are patterns we are familiar with through images and symbols we encounter in myths, in fairy tales, and in the arts, and in popular culture, and even in an astrology chart. Basically, they're everywhere. They're tales as old as time, tunes as old as song. See, here we recognize these icons, these images, and without pulling up a website or researching, we could all likely come up with full descriptions and possibly even stories about each of these and the worlds they inhabit. And this is how archetypes animate us. We just know them, some more than others, but we're familiar with them. A little bit more about archetypes. As Robert Moore and Douglas Gillette wrote, they provide the very foundation of our behaviors, our thinking, our feeling, and our characteristic human reactions. They are the image makers that artists and poets and religious prophets are so close to. I mean, they really are what animate us, which we know corresponds with our astrological birth chart. I mean, a Taurus is animated very differently than a Sagittarius, for example. And with this understanding, we can really start to see how astrology is very archetypal, as the chart is filled with images that inform all these qualities and thinking and feeling, etc. But said differently, they are our heart, those patterns and images that pump through us and animate us about all areas of life, who we want to date or not, how we manage money, what we want to study. I mean, they animate what we are drawn toward, sometimes exclusive of everything else, and what we stay away from. I lost where I read this, but I did read that the ancient Greeks believed the heart is the center of imagination. And I do believe this, especially in a world where heart disease is a #1 killer. As a little bit of history, a favorite of mine, psychologist and Jungian analyst James Hillman, the pioneer and archetype of archetypal psychology, wrote that archetypal psychology, it situates itself within the culture of Western imagination. It is a psychology deliberately affiliated with the arts, culture, and the history of ideas arising as they do from the imagination. I love this because, and I use a lot of popular culture and art and such in my astrology presentations. And we can connect this archetypal psychology with archetypal astrology, as astrology by its very nature is archetypal. And Carl Jung has been a prominent figure in the Western psychological imagination. So what does this all have to do with astrology? Jung said, stick with the image. And he also said, the starry vault of heaven, the night sky, is in truth the open book of cosmic projection in which are reflected the mythologisms, i.e. the archetypes. So we're seeing a connection here through Jung's insights between the starry night sky and archetypes. The constellations and the planets are archetypal in nature. Next is to understand Jung's sense of archetypes. I mean, much of his work was in the first part of the 20th century. At that time, in his day and age, we could say his vision was standard definition, maybe like an 800 by 600 aspect ratio, if you will. The archetypes for him were broad. He perceived the anima and animus, aka the feminine and masculine, but also the shadow, the self, the spirit, etc. You can see a number of them here. But now, decades after his death, we've really developed HD sight, high definition. So a resolution of say 1920 by 1080. If you know anything about monitors and computer aspect ratios and everything, we see much more detail than Jung saw in his time. It's just how we've developed. So where he perceived anima and animus, we can still see those, but we can also see the anima fine-tuned as, say, the femme fatale or the princess, the animus as the knight or the warrior. It's worth noting here, and this cannot be stressed enough, archetypes are not gendered. They are gender neutral. They are expressions of energetic patterns. So any gender could be an archetypal knight in the same way any gender could be an Aries sun. Keep this in mind as we move through the archetypes later on. Returning to another Jung quote, he said, if you are in search of soul, go first to your fantasy images, for that is how the psyche presents itself directly. All consciousness depends upon fantasy images. And archetypes are an imagistic, imaginative language, a language of the soul. So time for an example. I worked with a corporate vice president once whose favorite fairy tale was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It totally animated her. She even had a painting of them in her office. And one day when we were talking about it, we realized together She was the one female executive at the company, surrounded by 7 male executives. Symbolically, she was living her favorite fairy tale. I'll never forget this. This is how profoundly our fantasy images speak to us awarely or unawarely. They map out our lives. Are we living our favorite fairy tale? And how might we see our favorite fairy tale in our birth chart? That's a talk for another time, or I could say another once upon a time. But to keep it real, still, a favorite song by 80s artist Kim Wilde, a song called European Soul, has the lyric, "The world's realities are not to be denied, but must we keep destroying all our fantasies?" I mean, what a question. And this is the art of archetypal psychology, thus archetypal astrology. How do you image? How do you imagine the world around you? It likely has a lot to do with your astrological birth chart. Archetypes, those images, symbols, and patterns of the collective unconscious, become conscious when we look at an astrology chart. Each sign is archetypal, and each sign has a set of particular archetypes which correspond. Aries, for example, the mythic god of war, or Leo as royalty, the king and the queen. And it's not just the signs, as the planets also are archetypal. As Thomas More wrote, in the planets we encounter an imagination inflamed and incited by archetypal imagery, a transforming knowledge which can only be acquired through learning that is far beyond intellect alone. So it's about perceiving and imagining. When you saw those icons a few slides ago, it wasn't intellectual knowledge that told you the clown was the clown. You just knew it. And then you can start to put words to it. So similar to the signs, and there's a lot of overlap between ruling planets and signs, each planet has its corresponding archetypes. So whether the Aries knight in shining armor embarking on a new quest, the Gemini mercurial trickster creating mischief, magic, or delight, or the Scorpio detective investigating mysteries and unsolved crimes, the zodiac is filled with a cosmos of these rich archetypal patterns and their images that inform and animate our lives. In a couple more slides, we'll start exploring the signs and their ruling planets and their respective archetypes. But it's not a hard and fast, rigid science. So sometimes the sign becomes more of a focus. Other times the planets are more of a focus. But all in all, you'll start to see how when we stick with the image and recognize the archetypal nature of the images, the archetypes really do seem to fit. And this is what we're exploring for the rest of the presentation. I learned archetypes through Carolyn Mace and her Sacred Contracts class through her CMed Institute in Chicago. She has a deck of archetype cards, hopefully linked below, featuring, I think, 72, somewhere around there, of the most common archetypes, such as the networker, seeker, alchemist, victim. And actually I have some of them here to share to see. They're really like durable heavier than cardstock quality, clear laminated cards. Very good quality, well worth an investment if this is something of interest to you. So in her model, we each have 12 particular core archetypes that animate us, identified by the repeated patterns throughout our life. She didn't bring astrology into this, but I've noticed in my own explorations how these archetypes can also be seen in an astrological chart via the signs, the planets, the aspects, and house placements. And our astrological birth chart helps us recognize our own archetypes, though it's not required. And here's a reminder, archetypes are not concerned with gender. They are gender neutral, though may be associated with gendered expressions. We notice the imagery here varies tremendously, but for archetypes such as the mother and goddess, they are very feminine expressions, but this energy can be expressed through cisgender, transgender, non-binary, or any other gender identity or gender expression. The archetype, the energy pattern comes first, then is expressed in the physical world. And again, this is by no means an absolute science. There's overlap, there's room to explore, and a lot to learn. Some archetypal correspondences are more obvious than others. So what I'll be sharing is an intro and a way to help everyone start to perceive archetypally. So I decided to go through the signs by element, and the imagery around the elements helps to understand the archetypes. The four elements align with Jung's four types: thinking, intuition, sensation, and feeling. So we'll also see these influences along the way as well. But since this is an intro, we won't look too deeply at these, but it's a start. And to stay archetypal, we see how the elements and Jung's types show up in popular culture, even unconsciously, such as how the Harry Potter Hogwarts school has 4 houses, which happen to align with the 4 elements to various degrees, i.e. some stronger than others. But really, the Hogwarts sorting hat, its role is essentially identifying students' archetypal nature and aligning them with the house that helps them to best be who they are meant to be. It's so archetypal, I just love it. So we start with the fire signs, Aries, Leo, and Sagittarius, with fire aligning with Jung's intuitive type. Intuition deals in instincts, potentials, and possibilities, as well as images, hunches, and an overall gut feeling about things. These qualities help inform many of the archetypes for the fire signs. And the sorting hat would likely place fire signs in Gryffindor. Fire signs, you might belong in Gryffindor, where dwell the brave at heart. Their daring, nerve, and chivalry set Gryffindors apart. Thanks to the Harry Potter fandom wiki for that. But brave at heart, daring, nerve, chivalry, all important keywords for the fire signs and their archetypes. So let's look at the 12 signs of the zodiac, along with their ruling planet or planets, plural. Since Gordon Mullings introduced you to the planets and J.P. Hawthorne introduced you to the signs, I will only provide a brief look at those to help set the stage here, but check out their videos for a much more in-depth look. So beginning with Aries, Aries is the cardinal fire sign, meaning it's about initiating, starting, and wants to do something. The image I've come to use for Aries, cardinal fire, is the matchstick. When you light a match, it's very intense and is the kind of fire that starts, for example, other fires or a candle. In true Aries fashion, while it's intense and bright, it has a limited run on its own. So this is a major Aries image and will help us understand some of the Aries archetypes. Little more imagery here though. As you've learned, the symbol of Aries is the ram. Rams are male bighorn sheep, animals that live in the mountains and, gotta love this, often settle arguments with fights that include ramming their heads into each other. If you know any Aries, have you ever experienced this? and its ruling planet Mars. Action, aggression, and anger. Mighty Mars is about courage and life force. So when we stick with the images, we start to see how particular archetypes are expressions of these Aries and Mars qualities and patterns. Some major Aries archetypes are listed here, including the hero, the athlete, the warrior, the knight. Most of these archetypes contain some quality of beginnings or starting something. Ruled by Mars, there's a very active quality about Aries archetypes. And like the cardinal matchstick, the matchstick fire, the quality of that, it's not necessarily long lasting. And many of these are instinctual and act on gut feeling. I'll include the mythic representation. Like on here, you see myth is Aries and Mars, but I'm not going to go into detail on those, as I recommend you check out Jean Shinoda Boland's books, Gods in Every Man and Goddesses in Every Woman, which I believe are linked below. But remembering archetypes are neutral, we know any gender could possibly be an archetypal god or an archetypal goddess. That's to be determined. So for each sign and planet, I've chosen a couple archetypes to take a bit of a closer look. Though with 12 signs and their ruling planets, it's really, of course, only an overview. So the Aries Knight is the knight out on a quest, action, and adventure, aka the knight errant, the quest for the Holy Grail, for example, or more broadly, that quest for adventure. And notice in the dictionary definition here, this archetype includes military skill, so connects us with Mars and martial qualities. But it is that instinctual need to go out and move and begin the quest and search. It's all part of the image. And this isn't a literal knight, remember, though I mean, it comes from the history of the knight imagery, but someone with this archetype might feel as though, say, finding a new job is akin to the quest for the Holy Grail, for example. That's how you start to think, and symbolically and archetypally. And consider the knights in a jousting match, not unlike the two rams butting heads. I mean, you can't make this stuff up, really. That's just how archetypes work. The patterns always find an expression. And the athlete archetype, athleticism, literally a figure immersed in the expression of physical strength and competition, but symbolically, archetypally, perhaps someone facing physical challenges and learning the strength and endurance from facing those challenges, or how one approaches their fitness routine, or even how do you approach managing your finances. Maybe somebody, this archetype informs like developing a structure and a routine to build strength within their financial stability. So as athletes, if you think about another way, athletes train for years for the hopes of what is often a short-lived Olympics, one moment in time. Thank you, Whitney Houston. And that just also emphasizes that sort of the short matchstick quality of Aries. And thirdly, not unlike the knight, when he sets out on the quest for the Holy Grail, the hero archetype goes it alone. Going it alone, familiar to folks with strong areas in their charts? This could be the hero archetype in your life. The iconic hero figure of my childhood was Star Wars's Luke Skywalker. That moment when he's on Tatooine, looking at the sun's setting, that was his intuitive call to begin the hero's journey. A cardinal gut feeling there was more to life, and he knew he needed to set out on his own to discover what it is. Very much the hero. Next up is Leo, the fixed fire sign. My image for fixed fire is a fireplace. This fire isn't going anywhere. And while it's fixed in its single location, it has the ability to warm the entire room. Feel familiar to any Leos? It's this quality of fixed fire that can help us understand some of the Leo archetypes. For Leo, we see the image of the lion, the king of the jungle, aka the Lion King, fierce and proud. Hakuna Matata. Often the image of the lion is accompanied by the young lion cub. I mean, think about it. We don't usually see baby scorpions with Scorpio imagery, do we? Or baby crabs with Cancer imagery? But think of Mufasa and Simba in The Lion King, very much part of the archetypal process of Leo. And the sun rules Leo. The sun is yourself, how you shine. And the sun is fixed at the center of our solar system and the planets orbit around it. So the sun is about nobility, the heart, confidence, and pride. So we get into Leo archetypes, such as the king and the queen, the entertainer, divine child, knight. Again, knight is another, we looked at the knight in Aries, but it's also Leo expressed differently. And there's the lover and the gambler. We can see a fixed quality with these archetypes. And in many of them, that quality of shining bright or warming a room. So first up is the king and queen, or broadly, the archetype of royalty. As mentioned, Mufasa and Simba in The Lion King, these characters embody the royal archetypes and the archetypes of the king and queen. We all know those people in our lives who live life as though they were ruling from the throne and the world is their palace. The rest of us, their servants. That's this archetype showing up in the world. But also think of the fixed nature of Leo and how kings and queens sit on a throne fixed to the palace. They don't intermingle with the people unless on rare occasion. But when a king or queen rules benevolently, they can warm the entire kingdom. And reminding us that archetypes are not gendered, we often see the queen archetype show up in the drag community, i.e. Bob, the drag queen, drag race royalty. Though interestingly enough, not every drag queen is a queen archetype, because it all depends on the individual person's archetypal nature. So here we have the Leo knight compared to the Aries knight. This one is knighted by the king or queen for their service to the kingdom. It's not about the quest for the Leo knight, but about service to the kingdom, good deeds and bringing honor to the palace. This knight doesn't go it alone like the knight errant might. So much of it is about service to and protecting the royals. And next up is the gambler archetype. I mean, so many games to play, that fun quality of Leo. Think of the literal images around gambling. In poker, we have a royal flush, and the royal court appears in the jack, the queen, and the king. And a poker face, what is it? It's a fixed face. Well, hopefully unmoving, but it's just that quality of Leo comes through. But there's also symbolic gambles. Relationships can be a gamble with the heart. Leo rules the heart, or a gamble with taking the time to write a book or moving to a new city. All these are very much the gambler archetype, and at least symbolically often aligned with following your heart. So that was Leo, and now on to Sagittarius, the mutable fire sign, adaptable, changeable fire. An image for mutable fire is a wildfire. It spreads around, expands, often covering a great distance. This mutable fire quality for me is also akin to the fire of the Olympic torch. Think about the great journey the torch travels as it passes from hand to hand to hand across such great distances. And like the wildfire, reaches a location quite distant from its point of origin, much like Sag archetypes. The symbol for Sagittarius is the centaur with bow and arrow. The arrow, akin to the glyph for Sagittarius, shows the symbolic ability to see far, though often this is also the gut feeling about what's on the horizon, up ahead, and the image is larger than life. And I just had to throw in Princess Merida from Disney's Brave here, though not a centaur, duh. I love her as a Sag image with her fiery red hair and her love of archery. And interestingly enough, Kelly MacDonald, who voices her in the movie, has a Sagittarius moon Neptune, A+ on archetypal casting. And Sagittarius is ruling planet Jupiter, about excess, exaggeration, and expansion, to name a few. These connect us with Sag archetypes, such as the seeker, the explorer, storyteller, or priest. All these have a way of expanding our horizons or seeing far. Teachers expand our knowledge, sometimes to a great extent. Storytellers take us on expansive journeys, and visionaries can often see where that Sagittarian arrow may land, far off in the distance. So the seeker is an archetype that pursues truths, often of a spiritual nature. Many questions that lead to rich explorations or journeys, seeking answers, insights, and truths. It's as if they know on that intuitive level, the arrow of truth has already been shot, landed, and they seek out that new truth. The path of the seeker, whether an internal journey or external journey, often brings the seeker over a great distance of knowledge and insights as they seek the truth. And here we have the storyteller, taking an experience and expanding it, making it perhaps larger than life, or taking people on a journey that expands their horizons. New worlds, new creatures, new ideas. Myths contain many stories, and some stories are built of wonderfully exaggerated ideas. Some people just naturally tell stories of their life's experiences. Others tell stories through photography or their travels. Whatever the setting, this archetype can spin anything into a tale to tell, or looks at the world as telling a tale. And the teacher can be literalized into a job or career, such as a university professor, but archetypally, it's anyone who teaches, anyone with that inner connection, with always wanting to help others expand their horizons and learn more beyond that early level of education. I mean, we see a ton of astrology teachers or tarot teachers, and they teach from what they've learned, which doesn't require a formal degree. They just have that instinctual, natural urge and that draw to teach what they themselves have learned. Fantastic archetype. So those are the fire signs and some of their brave, chivalrous, warm, and adventurous archetypes. And next up, our adventure takes us to a bit of a more grounded energy, the earth signs, Taurus, Virgo, Capricorn. The earth signs correspond to Jung's sensation type, the world of the five senses. They are realistic and live in concrete reality, whatever those mean. They are rational, factual, and matter of factual, meaning the world of solid matter and facts. And they're very practical. And the sorting hat tends to place earth signs in alignment with Hufflepuff. Earth signs, you might belong in Hufflepuff, where they are just and loyal. Those patient Hufflepuffs are true and unafraid of toil. So hard work, dedication, and patience, all qualities of the earth signs. The magic for Hufflepuff might be herbology, for example, but this is all earthly energy. So we start with the fixed earth sign Taurus. For fixed earth, I have been going with two different kinds of images, the first of which is a tree. Simple enough. With its roots firmly planted in the earth, it's fixed in place, and its growth is from that fixed point. And second, a built house. It's complete, and with rare exceptions, remains fixed in the place it was built. These images can help us understand the energy and the patterns of the Taurus archetypes. And the Taurus symbol is the bull, the primal animal known for its stationary stance. Its size and strength making it a rather stubborn creature, but when it gets moving, like the image with the toreador here, it gains such momentum. The charging bull is a force of nature. And I just had to throw this image in here. It just cracks me up. I mean, the mechanical bull. Talk about a Taurus fixed earth image. I mean, whoever imagined this challenge was archetypally brilliant. But really, when you think about it, could a fixed sign like Taurus stay on very long? Or just stuck in one spot? Or would the mutable, adaptable signs fare best with all the ball moving around so much? To be determined. And while the bull is very primal, it's a primal instinctive animal, we find Taurus is ruled by Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, quite the contrast to the bull. But Venus is also about the arts and compromise and admiration. And this contrast between Venus and the bull is recognized archetypally. The tale as old as time, Beauty and the Beast. With the primal animalistic nature of the bull and Belle representing beautiful Venus, it's a pairing utterly aligned with Taurus and very much part of the Taurus archetype. But there's also the myth I wanted to touch on, the mythic ferocious minotaur. I mean, the word itself, Minotaurus, which lived in the mythic labyrinths in Crete. I won't get into the details here, but in this image from ancient mythology, we see the blending of the head of a bull with the body of a human. Another part of Taurus here, the contrast between human civility and the primal bestial nature of the bull. And here are some Taurus archetypes. The hedonist, the nature child, the damsel, the artist. Also threw in the bully, fixed in spot, intimidating the smaller people. So the hedonist, a lover of the finer things in life. You may have heard the term the lap of luxury. The hedonist loves the pleasures of the senses and the sensual world. Very Venus meets Earth. And I just thought I'd throw in here this bottle of wine pictured here. It's the most expensive wine. And I'm not going to try to name the full name of it, but you see the Romane Conti here. But I read that it sold at an auction in October of 2018 for $558,000. That one bottle of wine. I wonder if it was a Taurus or a hedonist archetype who purchased it. And here we come to the prostitute archetype. Many of you probably immediately jump to a stereotypical image, but beyond the stereotype is the archetype. And the archetype here deals with self-worth and self-value. The prostitute asks archetypally, what's your price? 99 cents? 11.99? Or $1 trillion? Other questions the prostitute may ask, are you for sale? Or are you not for sale? Basically, where do you compromise and settle for less than what you truly want for security? Very profound archetype. And here we have the goddess. This is the goddess who embodies earthly qualities and Venusian beauty and love. Dynamics of worship and often larger than life are part of the goddess archetype, and people who just don't play by mortal rules. Though mythic pantheons include a number of different goddesses which associate with different signs or planets, here we recognize Aphrodite in the sense of earthly beauty and aesthetics. And our lovely Muppet beauty, Miss Piggy, is a wonderful example of the archetypal goddess, worshipped by Muppets fans around the world. And though small in stature, she was larger than life with her presence. And I encourage everyone, please check out Eric E. on Twitter, at Plutonic Moon. Brilliant and unique ways of expressing astrology and more. I mean, this post still cracks me up. It's so accurate to an archetype, as Miss Piggy herself was indeed a goddess in her own way. And look at in the bottom corner there, such the hedonist archetype. Though interestingly enough, Wikipedia actually identifies Miss Piggy as a Gemini, but Eric E. was on it. Give you a moment to read that. But they're just brilliant with their posts, really. At Plutonic Moon, check them out. And also, again, reminding us that archetypes are not gendered. We do come across the goddess archetypes from time to time in, for example, the drag world. Shea Coulee, for example, is one of the most worshipped drag queens, with the imagery evoked through her drag, very possibly the goddess archetype here. So next up is Virgo, mutable earth. I have a couple images for mutable earth. First is sand on the beach. It can be formed and reformed into all kinds of different shapes and images, notably sand castles. Then there's clay, the mutable earth that can become almost any form or shape we would like it to be, so very mutable in every which way. And as Mercury ruled, it's interesting to often see two symbols for Virgo, the maiden and the angel. Both reflect a particular quality of purity, which connects us with the archetypal image of the Virgin for Virgo. And Mercury rules Virgo. And here, Mercury is about thinking, speaking, editing, and cleverness, among other qualities, which we'll see again later with Gemini. Virgo archetypes, a few are the servant, the virgin, the scribe, the healer, and the monk or the nun. So our first Virgo archetype is the healer, though not exactly the wounded healer we hear about. This is the healer working with herbs and plant medicine, for example, or hands-on healing like massage therapy or acupuncture, all fitting with the sensation, sensing type from Jung. Virgo gets into the details and the nitty-gritty. So just these images alone show the need for an exceptional amount of knowledge and detail. What mixes go together, what to avoid, and with acupuncture, all the different points and interactions to be aware of. Hashtag so Virgo. And when we think of that mutable quality, I mean, look at all those herbs or spices and or plant medicine. I mean, different mixtures can go and are mutable together with each other to create different healing qualities for different conditions, adaptable and shiftable to whatever the need is. And the servant archetype, whether it's the image of the butler or the maid, putting the maid in maiden, they keep order and cleanliness. Interestingly enough, in Shakespeare's Comedy of Errors, servant Dromo of Syracuse says, and I love this, "Thither I must, although against my will, for servants must their masters' minds fulfill." I had never thought about the servant like that before, but that connects us so much with the mercurial part of Virgo and the servant archetype. I mean, so much of a mercurial connection in that statement about the servant. And on a purely archetypal level, to whom or to what are you in service or of service? Very powerful archetype there. And the Virgo angel is someone who will show up to help out and then head out. Very much that behind the scenes dynamic, but like the mythic angels will appear and disappear. But also with the messenger quality of Mercury, Virgo angels can also be singers, i.e. Katie Lang or Andrea Bocelli or Dolly Parton. Whether it's their presence, their voice, the messages in their music, or all of the above, there is a purity and otherworldly quality about them, very much about the angel archetype. And the last of the earth signs is Capricorn, the sign of cardinal earth. An image I use for cardinal earth is the structure of a house starting to be built. It's the skeleton of the house, but an absolute necessary starting point. And we see the image symbol for Capricorn is often the goat, or otherwise the mer goat, part, part fish. It's a fascinating image and a topic to look deeper into another day, but part of it, I think, has to do with a kind of contradictory quality about Capricorn and its ruling planet Saturn, which I'll just touch on a little bit more later in these archetypes. But the mountain goat is a sure-footed climber, commonly seen on cliffs and on ice. The mountain goats have beards, and their heavy-duty wool coats protect them from the earthly elements. Pretty symbolic all around of Capricorn, and it helps us to understand the Capricorn archetypes. Capricorn's ruling planet Saturn is about authority, control, and time. It brings structure and discipline and has a seriousness, a gravitas, or a weight about it. And you know, here's where one of those sort of contradictory things with the image of the mergo, it could sort of be seen symbolically, but when you think of Saturn as time, Saturn is the mythic god Kronos. So Chronos, logical time, which is chronological time, linear time. But time is also cyclical in nature. So this dual expression of time, linear and round, might be a bit of how we can connect it to that image of the mergoat, two different expressions of something. And we see Capricorn, Saturn archetypes include the Midas miser, the father, the hermit and the tyrant, among others. And I think I left it off here, but the king archetype can be Capricorn as well as Leo, but the Capricornian king is more of the authoritarian, dictatorish kind of king, disciplinary. So first, let's look at the Midas miser archetype. The miser is familiar in the image of Scrooge, easily Saturnian in nature, with the conservative, restricting qualities. Scrooge never extends his hand to anyone, always keeps it restricted, keeping his wealth to himself. Think of the symbolism of that. Midas, on the other hand, where's Midas here? There he is. Midas, on the other hand, reached out to everything in the interest of wealth and riches, even gaining the ability to turn anything to gold with his touch. You may have heard the Midas touch. But with his Midas touch, still in the realm of earth, remember that, and the five senses, he encountered many hardships. I mean, you can't even eat when everything you touch turns to gold. Hello, Saturn. Restricted life, which eventually led to him starving to death. So looking archetypally, this can also be an archetypal pairing in the business world, for example, with how a business is run, or an archetype around generosity and managing or controlling your riches of all kind. How does your hard work pay off? That might be a question for the Midas miser archetype. So we get to next the archetypal architect, literally a builder of buildings, but symbolically any kind of builder, builder of dreams, builder of community, builder of ideas, etc. You get the sense of this. But think of how Saturn rules the bones, the very structure of our bodies. Archetypes are naturally attuned to the needs of the inner structure, the foundational structure that will create stability and endurance. Big Saturn Capricorn word, endurance. And the inner structure is what helps a building's structure endure. And then a floor plan of the blueprints, which shows the structure, the boundaries and limits of each area within the home or the building. These are key images for archetypes, for architects, and the archetypes. Say that 10 times fast. And lastly, with Capricorn, the judge archetype, which is not about being judgmental. Anyone can be judgmental. Just turn on the news. But consider the heaviness, the weight, and the gravitas of judicial hearings and sentencings. It takes a Saturnian authority to know the wisdom and carry the weight of such real judgments. And it takes time and experience to be at the level where you could be appointed a judge. Judges carry the gravity of the situations they preside over. So think about this in any of the contexts, like take a house, like the fourth house of home. The judge archetype might be for somebody how they discern and decide what happens with family and how that is managed, or relationships might take on this quality. Not always ideal or wonderful, but that might be how it plays out in the symbolic expressions. So that was a look at the earth signs and a bit of their corresponding archetypes, those practical, valuable, hardworking, and discerning archetypes, which moves us right along to the air signs, Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius, which corresponds to Jung's thinking type. Thinking types are rational, objective, and logical. They are about the intellect and analysis. Logic and logical connections are important, as is understanding things intellectually. And when we return to the Hogwarts sorting hat, we see the air signs of Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius align well with, where did it go? Ravenclaw. Or yet in wise old Ravenclaw, if you've a ready mind, where those of wit and learning will always find their kind. Welcome to House Ravenclaw. And I read that Ravenclaw House prizes learning, wisdom, wit, and intellect. That's Jung's thinking type to a T. And remember here, it's worth noting, these aren't just sun signs, but can refer to any planets and an aspect to the air signs. So our first air sign, Gemini, is mutable air. And I have to admit here, the images for the qualities of air signs are the most challenging for me to come up with. So when we think about air that is changeable, shifting, and adaptable, I mean, it's been kind of tough, but I did kind of settle on this image of a tumbleweed. I mean, work with me a bit here. Mutable air, it moves things along, and like the tumbleweed can adapt and change as the air shifts. Where has it come from? Where is it going? It can be all over the place. So with air corresponding to thinking, Gemini thoughts can be like this, adaptable, moving around swiftly from thought to thought to thought, and kind of sometimes even all over the place. And the symbol for Gemini is the twins. So there's something here about duality, doubling, and duplicating here. And we see in all kinds of images of twins, but can sort of help us start to build on these archetypal images for Gemini. Gemini is ruled by Mercury, which connects us with ideas of intellect, learning, and gossip. And curiously enough, also things like rehearsals, mirrors, and transcripts, which when you really think about it, they all have that sort of twin or repeating and duplicating quality about them. But it really is about communication, thinking, and speaking. So with Gemini archetypes, we see some intellectual and airy energy here with the messenger, the eternal child, the student, the trickster. So let's take a look. Among Gemini archetypes, as I mentioned, we see the trickster. And, you know, one of the origins of the trickster archetype is the Greek mythic god Hermes, aka Mercury, pictured here. As the story goes, and actually before the story, notice with Hermes, he has the two pairs of wings on his feet and on his head. So symbolizing the intellect of the head and the flight of thoughts and the swiftness of movement of the feet. So as the story goes, Hermes' brother Apollo was the god of shepherds. And one day Hermes put shoes on the hooves of Apollo's flock, but he put them on backwards. So think about Mercury retrograde here. So when he put the shoes on the flock backwards, he walked them away from the field. So when Apollo went to look for his flock, he couldn't find them. He had been tricked. And of course, we have this archetype sometimes with the image of twins, and twins who play tricks with others, and their twin images. But really with Mercury retrograde, it's become known for like tech mishaps and such, and things going awry. But there's always more to Mercury and the trickster, as mercurial mishaps may very well be accompanied by a lesson of some sort. What have you, Gemini, learned? What is the message the messenger is sending during Mercury retrograde? Love this archetype. So then there's the eternal child is a Gemini archetype, familiar to us in the figure of Peter Pan, eternally youthful and a character of the air. He's from Neverland, which when you think about it, never landing, never, it's the thinking mode. It's never the sensation mode, always in the air, never landing. He's eternally in the air. This is the thought of Gemini and Mercury, always thinking, always moving from thought to thought to thought. And eternal children, no matter what their age, always maintain some sort of youthful quality about them, whether it's intentional or not. And advancing, okay. And the dilettante, often referred to as the jack of all trades or the Jill of all trades, master of none. Think of this like the eternal child, always moving about, flying around. The dilettante finds many things interesting and learns a lot about things, but never lands too long on just one thing or goes too deep, as it's always curious and interested to learn about or be involved with another hobby or another activity. Very, very Gemini archetype, the dilettante. Which brings us to Libra in cardinal air, which is initiatory air. And again, as I mentioned, these images have been more difficult for me to come up with something that really fits the way, I mean, the matchstick did for Aries and the fireplace. I mean, those are so perfect. So these are more challenging, but what I came up with is bubbles. I was imagining blowing bubbles and how the initiatory air creates the bubble and the bubble forms from the air. So, you know, in like comics and stuff, you get the thought bubbles that come up. Kind of reminded me of that. Thoughts or words or the intellect can be like this, where a new thought begins to form and we go with it rather than jumping from thought to thought to thought. We go with the thought we have and see where it takes us. So Libra is represented by the scales of justice, always recognizing two sides. And I'll throw in a little piece here that when you look at the glyph, see, let me just show that again. When you look at the glyph for Libra here in the scales, it represents the fulcrum of the scales where the balance pivots or rests. I love how that fits into there. But we hear all the time about balance and maintaining balance. But what Libra is about is the movement of the scales up and down and back and forth, and how the movements are always in relation to one another. Very Libra there. And we saw Venus as ruler of fixed sign Taurus. And here we see Venus again as ruler, but of cardinal air sign Libra. The distinctions between earth and air will help us understand the different archetypes we'll see here for Libra and Venus, where Venus is still the goddess of love and beauty, but Libra helps show Venusian qualities such as companionship, negotiations, justice, and chivalry, very relationship qualities. And we hear a lot of court terms here, including the art of courtly love, chivalry, or contracts. So the Libran archetypes bring in a relational quality about them, an imagery that seems to fit with the scales. So we have the mediator, the princess, the advocate, the diplomat. Often an intellectual quality or important communication skills are part of these archetypes. So such as the mediator. And much like the image of the scales of justice and the fulcrum between the scales, the mediator stands between both sides of two different parties and mediates or negotiates differences in the effort of balancing the scales between the two sides, mediating a relationship between opposing forces of any kind. I mean, an artist can mediate between colors and balance, or a writer may need to mediate between plot devices in their novel. Anything that could use or require a middle person can connect with the mediator archetype. Here we see the princess archetype. With the princess, we recognize the beauty of Venus, as well as the value of Venus, as princesses, whether literal or archetypal, resonate riches. Richness of money or a rich aesthetic value. Venus here reminds me how I once read the symbol of Venus is akin to a hand mirror. And how often do pretty princesses look in the mirror? And it's interesting in the world of psychology, how there are arguments for both the detrimental side of children adoring princess culture, but also the empowering side of that, of children finding their strength through this archetype. But we notice here with that, the two sides of the scale showing up. And remember, archetypes are not gendered, as Mother Cheryl Kilo Davis wrote in her book about her son, which she called My Princess Boy, a mom's story about a young boy who loves to dress up. I mean, check it out. Check this out online, and you can find her website where she has pictures of her boy dressing up in real princess gowns and just totally adorable. It's beautiful. And the artist, a very Venusian archetype. And in Libra, consider again the scales, music scales going up and going down. But there is balance, and how often different art forms are concerned with balance and precision. I mean, music composing and singing, for example. Singing is all about cardinal air movement through the vocal cords, and not to mention beautiful harmonies coming together. Very much part of the Libra artist archetype. And our final air sign, the fixed air of Aquarius. So the image, I've come up with a couple images for fixed air, and it's a fan or a windmill, kind of like a computer fan, and how it's fixed in place. And unlike the opposite sign, Leo's fire warming a room, this air keeps things cool, keeps things from overheating, very much like an intellectual quality there. And windmills are fixed in place and use air and wind to harness energy. The symbol for the water bearer, for Aquarius, is the water bearer, sometimes with a person emptying an urn of water, or often just the emptying urn itself. I mean, with bottled water being such a sign of our times, everyone seems to be water bearers and water carriers these days. Maybe the incorporation of the Evian Water Company in 1789 was the real start of the age of Aquarius. So Aquarius is ruled traditionally by Saturn, which we saw with Capricorn, but its modern ruler is Uranus. So keeping in mind the Saturnian qualities, we'll look to Uranus here. The planet symbolizing liberty and liberation, uniqueness, sudden happenings, and revolution, key images for Aquarian archetypes. And the Aquarius archetypes, it's a rather large list, but includes the genius, the networker, the orphan child, and the liberator, for example. This really could be a whole talk in of itself to look at Aquarius archetypes. They all could, really. And so let's start with just a look at the orphan child. I mean, we saw the eternal child with Gemini, but here we have the orphan child, the child who feels like the outsider, not part of any particular tribe. Images of literal orphaned children vary from Little Orphan Annie and Oliver Twist to images of forgotten children, bleak and sad. But from the archetypal perspective, these children are the ones who can grow up independent of any tribe, with their own ideas and unique thoughts, and an ability to see situations in life through their own unique lens. Very empowering. And outsiders are needed in order to see outside of the norm, outside of the collective view, and beyond status quo and tradition. Hello, Aquarius, and hello, orphan child energy. And next up is the revolutionary, an archetype about dramatic change. We often hear it in revolutionary ideas, where ideas are connected to the air signs. But it's an archetype that recognizes the need for change, often involving an uprising to bring in the new, often after periods of oppression and hardship, bringing in ideas around equality and freedom. Libraries have been written about famous revolutionaries over the centuries. It's a very prominent archetype when its time has come. And the third archetype we'll look at for Aquarius is the genius. We often hear about Aquarius or Uranus as the genius, brilliant, brilliant humans with ideas and abilities that almost seem superhuman. But it really, to me, at times, it's an archetype we can all relate to. See, in ancient Greek myth, Uranus was Uranos, the starry sky, which includes our solar system. And when we think of an astrological birth chart, we can see it as our own unique inner reflection of the Uranian starry sky. And our unique astrological birth chart reflects our unique genius. And with Uranus as modern co-ruler of Aquarius, the genius archetype seems ever more important in the times ahead. Fascinating archetype. So that concludes the air signs, Gemini, Libra, and Aquarius, and their witty, relatable, mindful, and intellectual archetypes. Now let's turn the page to our final section. The water signs and the element of water, corresponding with Jung's feeling type. So the three water signs, Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces, are concerned with feelings and emotions and emotional connection. How do you feel about it, good or bad, pleasant or unpleasant? How does it affect you? But again, how does it make you feel? And to return to the sorting hat one last time, we see water aligns with, and there's really only one left, so I think we all know it, Slytherin. Or perhaps in Slytherin, you'll make your real friends. Those cunning folks use any means to achieve their ends. You know, honestly, probably the least flattering of all the sorting hat pieces. I mean, I'd love to recraft it at some point, but it is hard to ignore how in the movies and the books, the Slytherin students and alumni do tend to act on their feelings more than the other houses. But these are the signs that deal in feelings. And I wanted to do things a little bit differently for the water signs here, because I wanted to share an absolute favorite quote about opera. As extraordinary opera singer Joyce DiDonato describes it, she says, "The only way I can justify what opera is that we're dealing with human emotions that are so vast and profound that they have to be sung. Speaking it simply isn't enough." And I think about the water signs with this and that enormous, vast world of human emotions where speaking just can't always capture what's going on. And we'll see how water sign archetypes often fit into this idea. So let's look at Cancer, the cardinal water sign. Beginning, initiatory water. The image I tend to go with for cardinal water is a river, as rivers have distinct movement. They travel, and anyone on a river starts traveling with it the moment you plop down in it. It gets things moving. Drop anything in a river and it most likely starts moving. And Lake Itasca is the source, the initiation of the Mississippi River, the start of it. And from it, the river moves. So, and also as a side note here, consider the planet Jupiter exalted in Cancer. I don't know if you've learned about exaltations yet, but if you haven't, you will at some point soon, I assume. But as rivers lead to larger bodies of water, like lakes or oceans, we see this expansive, broadening Jupiterian image fit with Cancer and the river image. They lead, they expand to larger areas. So for Cancer, we see the Cancer symbol as the crab with its pinchers that can represent a certain sort of clingy nature of Cancer at times. But there is a lot to this image. The crab, the crustacean with the hard, tough outer shell and soft, tender inside. This symbolizes Cancer so perfectly, as this is the water sign that is emotional, but without the shell, it's vulnerable and thus needs its protection. And like the crab, Cancerian people share this trait of the vulnerability with the protection, as do key Cancer archetypes. Its ruling planet is the moon, which represents emotions, interestingly enough, nurturing, insomnia, and caution, among others. And here are some main Cancer archetypes: the mother, the caretaker, the rescuer, the crone, the clown, the prince, and the goddess. In this case, the goddess is Artemis and Diana, goddess of the moon and the hunt. But it's quite the mix. But if we stick with the images for Cancer, we'll see how these fit with the sign and often the moon. So the mother archetype can be a very Cancerian archetype when we think of the crab imagery. Symbolically, the mother serves as the protective shell for the baby, keeping it safe while it's unable to do anything for itself. But when we look further into this archetype, imagine the home, the house as a shell to protect the vulnerable children, and really adults in the bigger perspective of homes. But the archetype really resonates. And I think this is old and traditional. So with the way we understand gender and archetypes these days, it's probably not as totally on point, but I do remember learning many years ago the idea that the archetypal mother is the energy that keeps the child at home in the house to protect it and keep it safe, where the father archetypal energy is what puts the child outside of the house and out into the world. I just thought that was really interesting in the sense of the mother archetype and keeping the child protected in the shell of the house, very fitting with the Cancer, the crab imagery. And of course, then we have the symbolic mother birthing an idea into the world. Anybody can do that. Caring for and nurturing a work of art being created, or caring for staff in the office, perhaps. I mean, that's not ideal because coworkers aren't children, but that's where we kind of can get into mishaps with archetypes. But you start to get the idea how it's not necessarily a literal mother. And on a completely different note, and yet still exceptionally Cancerian, is the clown archetype. Imagine again the crab with the hard shell to protect the soft insides. The image of something on the outside, but something different on the inside. Clowns use makeup and showy, elaborate costumes to cover over feelings, protecting the person behind the clown getup. And when speaking it simply isn't enough, clowns aren't known for their intellect or their speaking abilities. It's all the emotion that's shown through the makeup and the movements. But it is really that you can get the idea that that clown getup and the outside is very much expressing and or protecting the real other feelings that are going on inside, where the excessive costuming becomes the shell. And even the clown car, the shell that contains a laughable amount of clowns, but not unlike our inner world and the extraordinary amount of feelings contained within. The symbolism there, I just love this archetype. But also when we think of clown, everything is exaggerated. Giant shoes, giant smiles, giant dramatic gestures. So again, thinking about Jupiter exalted in Cancer and how Jupiter expands things, clown imagery shows us this exaltation so wonderfully. And lastly, for Cancer, the prince archetype. I mean, these celebrities just look like princes, don't they? And they each have strong major Cancer placements in their chart, usually the sun and the moon or the ascendant, but it's really remarkable. And when you think about it, how the young prince, unlike the king, is often emotional, not having learned yet to rule with both the heart and the head. The prince is also much more vulnerable, as he has yet to develop the tougher exterior the king needs to rule the kingdom and make challenging decisions for the good of the kingdom. And finally, when you learn about progressions further down the line, I think, remember how a Cancer sun will progress into Leo, the sign of the king, which archetypally represents the young prince eventually becoming the king. The archetypal pattern is there, and it's really quite profound. So next up is Scorpio, the fixed water sign. Fixed as in fixated or unmoving. As for the elemental images, we have some different images for fixed water. First, I had to go with the swamp, though you could easily use like a lake, because swamps and lakes, I mean, they just sit there. They're fixed in one place. But I love the swamp with this because its depths are dark and mysterious and unknown. So that kind of really gets into the Scorpio depths of emotions. I mean, Scorpio is the water sign with such emotional depth, which can be difficult to work with at times. And people can often get stuck fixed if they venture too far into the swamp. But then there's another image of the glacier or the iceberg, frozen, fixed water. I mean, we could say cold as ice is its own emotional state. And while the glacier or iceberg can be beautiful, who knows what's been frozen inside? There's a lot here describing emotions beneath the surface, which can often reflect the depths and qualities of the Scorpio emotions. And we have the Scorpio image, the scorpion itself, which by itself shows us the kinds of emotional depths Scorpio is about. I mean, it instills fear and can be deadly, whereas the Cancer crab can be clingy and hang on with its pinchers. The scorpion tail with its stinger gets under the skin and can be poisonous and deadly. We saw Mars all the way back in Aries, and Mars is the traditional ruler for Scorpio. Scorpio's modern co-ruler, though, is Pluto, Lord of the Underworld. Intense Pluto is about transformation, mystery, corruption, and espionage. And I don't like I don't list cadavers, autopsies, and coffins here to be macabre, but more to symbolize Pluto's connection with the underworld, what's under the surface, deep down. And we see a number of these qualities in the Scorpio-Pluto archetypes: the detective, the alchemist, the femme fatale, and the vampire. So the detective, think of the detective TV shows like NCIS, Law and Order, CSI from a while back. They almost always inevitably begin with a death, and the scene is fixed in time. I love that about the relationship between the detective and Scorpio. Detectives also look below the surface into the depths of the past in their efforts to discover what happened. And think of Pluto, the smallest planet in the solar system, or at least in an astrology chart, but with a mighty impact. The images with the giant eye, the detective images with the giant eye and the magnifying glass, I mean, they remind me of Pluto's ability to magnify symbolically how tiny things can have a huge impact. I mean, that's kind of like the magnifying glass. So with the detective archetype and relationships, for example, perhaps your ex is not just a relationship that ended, but becomes a cold case. Or the relationship gets a post-mortem as you work through the feelings. When we imagine information as clues that bring us closer to a truth, that's the detective, always looking closer and beyond the obvious. It's still a pretty major archetype in Western popular culture. It's everywhere. Pretty great archetype. And then the femme fatale and the Don Juan, archetypes about sexual energy. And the femme fatale here is the seductive, deadly feminine. I mean, remember the scorpion can be a deadly creature, and this archetype with fatale in its name, fatal, is at the very least symbolically deadly, if not sometimes literal. If looks could kill is the femme fatale, and at least in many older Hollywood films, her beauty stops men dead in their tracks. I always remember this episode of CSI, I forget which CSI it was on, but there were triplets. There were triplets who were all like suspects in whatever the killing was that started off the whole episode. And they kept going back and forth talking to these triplets, trying to figure out, because they couldn't use DNA to solve it. But I always remember looking at it, and there was one of them who kind of dressed in these darker colors, sort of had this vibe about her that put off this femme fatale, this seductive quality. And since it includes that term fatale, I was thinking, I bet that's the one of the triplets who ends up being guilty. And it did. It turned out to be that way. So it's like you can have triplets, but if there's a femme fatale, a princess, and a goddess, they're going to behave very differently. But then there's also the Don Juan, the counterpart of the femme fatale, the seductive romantic masculine, who recognizes the beauty of sexuality, and especially the beauty underneath in all the different women that he pursues. And reinforcing again how archetypes are not gendered, Violet Chachki from RuPaul's Drag Race is a drag queen who flirts with the femme fatale in her drag in a very powerful way. And we couldn't talk Scorpio without considering the vampire archetype. What archetypal pattern? It's the archetypal pattern that drains life force. I mean, think about the image of a vampire. Its form is fixed at a point in time and remains that way eternally. And like the scorpion stinger, a bite from vampire teeth in myth gets under the skin and can be deadly. So symbolically, this can be recognized as in those people who drain our energy. They've been referred to as energy vampires. I mean, I haven't heard this term in recent years, but a while back it was what everybody seemed to be talking about. And at the time, the vampire was everywhere in popular culture. But it's a very intense archetype that really has so much more that could be said about it, but that would be another talk altogether. But the vampire character feeds off the life force of others, symbolic of dependency. So if you've ever been around people who just drain your life force with their energy, it may be this archetype revealing itself, but the symbolism is rich. And with that, when vampires do not have a reflection in the mirror, it's like people who have no sense of self-reflection and to recognize their own behaviors or their own role in parts of things. I mean, the symbolism over this archetype is huge and just incredible. And now onto Pisces, the final water sign, mutable water, shiftable and adaptable water. And is there any more mutable water than the ocean? The vast water shifting and bobbing about every which way, with the extraordinary amount of life moving every which way within its waters. It's such an image for mutable water. It's just perfect. And Pisces is symbolized by the two fish swimming in opposite directions. That's part of mutability, going one way, but then being able to switch it up and go another way when needed. But it's also about the pull of opposing forces. So we saw Jupiter back when we looked at Sagittarius, and Jupiter is also the traditional ruler of Pisces. So think expansive Jupiter and how expansive the ocean is. But Pisces also has a modern co-ruler, Neptune, who we'll touch on, where Neptune is illusions and mysticism, enchantment and floods, among so much more. And I just had to throw this in here. This is my absolute favorite astrology meme of all time. It's a very Neptune meme. Neptune aspecting Venus. I think it's just brilliant. And if, like me, you happen to have Neptune Venus aspects, you relate to this in just the most perfect way. And we see Pisces archetypes here with the dreamer, the mystic, the magical child, the poet, the martyr. All archetypes that capture dynamics where speaking it simply isn't enough. They embody so much feeling and experiences that can be difficult to put into words. So, for example, the martyr is very associated with religion, but the archetypal pattern comes into play when someone's devotion to a cause, a devotion so huge and oceanic, you lose the boundary between yourself and the cause. This can result in a lot of suffering, often feeling that suffering is on behalf of others or the cause, whether asked for or not. But it's that immense amount of spiritual devotion and the loss of self that brings this into the Piscean Neptune realm in a massive way. And it can be archetypal in so many other areas of life. In the family, in career, it can be an archetype that shows up in a lot of different places. And Pisces is another sign for the artist archetype. Remember the imagery of the coral and the life in the ocean? In the Piscean sense, the painter's palette is not unlike the rich brilliance of colors in ocean life. And perhaps a Piscean artist paints with watercolors, shifting and blending the palette onto the canvas. And looking deeper, like the two fish going in opposite directions, the artist is someone living in two worlds, which may or may not go in different directions, but the world of the reality of Earth life and inhabiting an Earth body, but also the numinous world, the mysterious world of the imagination, and where creative ideas dwell. The artist can feel pulled towards that world, as well as bringing this numinous world into the physical world of the senses. So much about the artist archetype here. And as a final archetype, we have the magical child, the imagination filled perhaps with fairies and unicorns. That imagination with the boundary between the concrete literal world and the fantastical supernatural world dissolved. This can be a challenging archetype, though, as with the vastness of Pisces and Neptune, it's easy to get so absorbed and enchanted in this fantasy world that you forget to actually do things and live life in concrete reality. That's often the requirements of daily life. But when it's harnessed in a really healthy way, this magical child archetype is utterly delightful. So those are the water signs: Cancer, Scorpio, and Pisces, and a glimpse into their vulnerable, emotional, fearful, deep diving oceanic archetypes. So yeah, there we are. A bit of an intro to archetypes via the astrological signs and planets. And so as you've seen, it's not just literalizing these images into a job or a career, but more about the patterns and dynamics animating our lives in every which way. Your fantasy images, as Jung talked about, animating our psyches. How do we experience the world? What are the patterns of our life and, as Jung said, our fantasy images? These help us begin to recognize which archetypes are animated in our life. With strong Aries or Mars placements, perhaps you recognize yourself as something of a warrior. Or with Scorpio or Pluto prominent in your chart, the detective animates your life, drawing you towards mysteries. Or perhaps a major focus on Cancer brings out your clown archetype. I mean, it's really a rich world of energies and images to explore. And I hope this little intro piques your interest to dive deeper and identify your own core archetypes. Your astrological birth chart can help guide you on your exploration. And with that, thank you so much for tuning in. You can contact me at my email address here and my website, www.blueastrology.com. Thank you so much, and thank you, Stormie.